Okay, good morning, everybody. Good Friday morning, and welcome to another episode of the Backyard Naturalist brought to you by the Urban Ecology Center. My name is Tim.
They
I will
have
be your
back in the box.
host for today's episode on a topic that until recently I would never have considered giving credence to because the topic is really plant neurobiology. And the reason that I wouldn't have thought of this as even a topic is because neurobiology, by definition, means that one is studying a nervous system. And the only organisms that I know that have a nervous system are animals. So there's a fundamental gap that can only be bridged when one considers the possibility that a plant has a nervous system or something like it. And I'm pretty sure that if you take one of those reflex hammers that the doctor uses on you to test your reflexes, they're not going to work in the same way on a plant. But at the same time, if a fly tickles the sensitive hairs on a Venus flytrap, that plant reflexes at an amazing speed. So, do plants have nervous systems? When I nailed this face to the front of my tree, did I hurt it? And so these are among the questions we're going to explore today on episode 9 of season 6 of the Backyard Naturalist. There was a PBS series, Maggie, called Plants Behaving Badly, but really we could just call it Plants Behaving. And with a nod to PBS, we'd like to extend our warmest gratitude to all of you watching this program, no matter the time or day. We're glad to be spending this time with you, and our very heartfelt thank you to all of the Backyard Naturalist subscribers out there, whether this is your first year as a subscriber or you've been with us for 2 to 6 years. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for your support in keeping this program going. For information on how you can support the program as a subscriber, please visit the Urban Ecology Center website or contact a member of the UEC's research team.
At least you have to wait for the presentation.
If somebody's got their microphone still on, that we could turn that off. That would be fantastic. All right.
Okay, let's get to it.
It's not winter yet, but it will be soon, or not.
Who wants
Who
ice?
knows? And hang on one second here. In a wildly unpredictable uh, climate, but regardless, the UEC's research team will bring you another college level course without the tests, without the homework. We'll be offering a winter ecology course to look at how our life, flora and fauna, including these badly behaving trees, are adapted to surviving and thriving in this climate that includes several months, usually of below freezing temperatures. So, what do you do if you're a spider or a frog or a fern or an oak tree when the water that we depend on for life freezes all around us and for some becomes unavailable? So those are the questions we'll be exploring in this fun program, which will be offered in February at the newly remodeled Urban Ecology Center. It's been quite a while since we turned the lights off at the old county building, and in a matter of months, we'll be turning the lights on in a brand new refurbished building, complete with an observation tower, a library, and an ecology room. What's an ecology room? You can find out at the new building when you take our winter ecology course. And there's no real astronomy news this week. I'm going to just there's still some great meteor showers. Pretty much for the next few months, meteor showers will still be out and all of these missions are occurring. But I'm going to get right down to talking about plants. And I'll start with an example that I think most people are at least slightly familiar with, which is the timeless chore of mowing the lawn. We have a past episode a few years back that looks at turf grass, Kentucky bluegrass, gives a little bit of a history about how our lawns became associated with grass. As popularity of grass lawns and grounds spread, so did the necessity of mowing the grass. It's a timeless chore. And before electric mowers, there were gas mowers, and before gas mowers, there were push mowers, and before push mowers, you had scythes and machetes, and you also had your living lawnmowers that doubled as fertilizer as well. But one of the things that transcends almost all of these lawn mowing methods is that there's one way you can tell a lawn is being mowed, even if you're not outside, because you can smell the scent of freshly cut grass. And for many, this brings nostalgia. It may remind them of chores or relationships with the people making you do the chores, or sometimes it's just that sound of the mowers, but that the scent of the grass reminds you that warmer temperatures are back after a winter. So the smell of freshly cut grass is quite distinct, as distinct as the color of the freshly cut grass leaves on your shoes. And it's I'm not here to try to ruin that nostalgia for you. Hang on to it, and we also know that maybe going away from grass lawns is a good thing, but it is always our job here on Backyard Naturalist to provide food for thought for your brain. And it never occurred to me anyway that freshly cut grass scent could actually be the result of freshly slaughtered blades of grass trying to send a warning signal to other grass in the world that the lawnmower is back and out for fresh grass blood or sap. That that pleasant freshly cut grass smell is actually a chemical distress call coming from the grass as a warning. And we've seen this before. We'll talk a little bit, in the mycorrhizal network beneath the soil, trees are sending chemical signals to other trees, and it's warning other trees that insects are attacking them, and then the neighboring trees are able to mount their own defenses against those insects. It's amazing, it's complex, but I never really gave pause to think about it. And then okay, I'm smelling this fresh cut grass. That's the grass crying out that it's under attack. And then that made me think, well, when I'm cutting grass or I'm pruning a tree or pounding a nail into a tree, do those plants actually feel pain? Why would they be crying out? And that's one of the central questions that we have in front of us today. And it's a good time to reference one of the main sources of information for today's episode, the How Stuff Works website. And there's a particular story that seeded this idea that was called Do Plants Feel Pain? A Primer on Plant Neurobiology by Lori Dove and Desiree Bowie. And the place to really start with a question as crazy as can plants feel pain is to recognize how very different we are from trees and plants. So plants can't talk or run through the forest or throw apples at you or try to whomp you in defense, even though we like to imagine worlds where these things happen. Plants are so different from us that it's almost impossible to even begin to understand what a plant may feel. Plants may actually feel pain, but it would be nothing remotely like the pain that we feel, probably physically or emotionally. And you think about this because mammals have been evolving for 200 million years, and look at the complexity that evolution has produced in us. Plants have been evolving for almost 500 million years. So it's impossible for me to believe that there aren't very complex systems in place in plants that might be thought of as something like pain or emotion or sentience. But I have to believe that there are systems in place that we have no idea about and may never know about. But if we open our minds a little bit, we can start to explore. So I can't imagine 500 million years of evolution not putting in place some really complex systems. So if we start with something that's more familiar to us, which is how we feel pain, and again, physical and mental pain aren't mutually exclusive, but we'll take a look at a simple, painful event, one that happens to me more often than I would like, which is stubbing my toe. So I'm walking, obviously not me, I'm walking in the attic with my socks, and there's a particular piece of wood that juts out from the railing that always gets me. Uh, and then, the first thing I do is I move my foot away, not I'm moving my foot towards the wood, and it's not like I'm kicking a soccer ball, but it doesn't take much because the wood is basically taking the speed of my toe from whatever speed it is to zero immediately. And so my toe absorbs that energy. That is the external stimulus, which in this case is acute high pressure, that activates the pain receptors in my toe, known as nociceptors. Um, Maybe Larry can tell me if I'm pronouncing that right. They in turn release neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers, and they make their way from my toe to my spinal cord into the thalamus in my brain, where the information is processed and that tells my body to respond. So some of the responses are reflexes. I don't think about it. Like if you remove your hand from a hot burner, you don't have to tell your hand to do that. If you get stung by a wasp, you may reflexively swat at the wasp, but then your brain's going to take over and saying, "What should I do? Like, are there other wasps? Do I need to get away from that nest?" And plants don't possess any of those systems, at least in the forms that we do. They don't have a nervous system, centralized nervous system like we do, or brain, but that doesn't mean that they can't exhibit complex signaling and communication systems through other methods that allow them to respond to their environment. So the stimuli for a plant to respond to are the ones that are likely most important to them for survival and reproduction. So things like sunlight and moisture, temperature, and then even things like touch and gravity. So we can start to take a look at some of the ways that plants respond to their environment. And the reactions can be very slow, barely perceptible to the human eye, like sunflowers growing towards the sun. You could stare at a sunflower all day and you would never notice the movement, but over time you would start to see that the head of the sunflower is moving, tracking the sun, trying to maximize photosynthesis, uh, just as we angle our solar panels on roof to receive an average the most direct rays of the sun. And that wouldn't, it would be more than photosynthesis because that's happening in the leaves. The compass plant uses the sun in its growth phase, but it's not constantly changing like the heads of the flowers. So the compass plant is so named because they orient their leaves in a north-south direction. As soon as they begin to grow, they stay that way for their short life. It is a way to get a rough idea of directions if you see a compass plant. I have a house plant that doesn't change day to day like a sunflower, but over the course of its lifetime, it has altered its growth in the stem based on me moving it around and kind of it feels like I'm being mean to it because it keeps having to move towards the sun. And so it's got you can see the results of when I move this plant to different areas. Um, there's a walking palm in the tropics, and in the walking palm, it doesn't just tilt towards the sun, its leaves or its flowers. The the walking palm actually sends out root shoots above ground towards the gap in the forest that is producing this light. They're a big competition for light, so that it's sunnier, and then it loses the root shoots that are away from the sun, which means over the course of several years, the trunk of the tree is actually moving over the ground just very, very slowly. So these represent kind of the most basic, straightforward ways in which plants react to external stimuli. Growing toward or away from the sun could be a reflex, could be nothing more complex than that. But for some plant systems, it's not just one thing that they're reacting to. And so in the case of vines, it's the physical environment. So you can't just tell a vine to grow. A vine needs to know what it can grow on and how to do that. It actually has to kind of start to figure things out. So it's not just a reflex. So for a vine like a bean plant to grow, first they have to find something to hold on to. And once they find it, they use their tendrils to explore that object and climb it. They have to distinguish between thick structures and thin structures, the orientation of the structure they want to climb in order to be successful. So it's not just a simple climbing code. There's got to be some kind of algorithm for both searching for an object and then when you find the object, how to manipulate your growth based on the characteristics of that object. There are amazing time-lapse videos. The one I'm going to show you all today is from Michael Pollan that shows bean plants moving. You may have seen it. They kind of move around and around in ever increasing circles until they land on an object. And then when they touch that object, they can start to climb. They can't see it or at least feel it in a way that we do, but they are able to sense it because there are times when they're not just going around and around. They're actually moving towards an object that they haven't yet touched. So they know that an object is there. They haven't touched it. And when they hit that object, then they got to figure out how to grow. So there's probably senses at work that we have no idea about. and they have to put into place a system that allows them to interact with that object. And the more you look into it, the more you see how complex the life of a vine actually is. This isn't like just a simple coding. And one of the craziest things about Michael Pollan's video in particular is that if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll send you the link. Just shoot me an email, and I'll include it in my weekly email next week. But you see a bean plant that just from a human perspective, it knows there's an object to climb nearby, and it appears just to be desperately reaching for the pole, which is pretty far away. It's not doing circles, it's going towards that pole. And again, from a human perspective, trying to empathize with that plant, it looks like it's taking a lot of quote unquote strength and determination for that bean plant to be reaching so far away, but still trying to hold the body off the ground from gravity. So you think ab muscles or something like that. Snakes are really, really strong in doing that. And then while it's reaching, Michael Pollan notices that even the leaves on the plant that have nothing to do, that aren't involved with the reaching, they just look like they're tense and helping the whole plant. And then as soon as that bean plant reaches the pole, it looks like the whole plant just relaxes. Like it's just a big old sigh of relief. And again, we can only tell the story from what we know from a human perspective, but it sure does look like that plant was struggling, made its goal, and was like, oh, I finally made it. And there's also a time lapse video of two bean plants that are competing to reach the same pole that's in between them. And they're both swinging their bodies around in circles until finally one of them grabs the pole and begins climbing. And what's crazy is at that moment, the plant that lost somehow seems to understand that the other plant has already reached the same pole that it was trying to reach. It lost the battle. And so that plant starts searching elsewhere for a different pole that's not even there. So it requires that the plant know where the pole is, where the other plant is, and that the other plant made it to the pole, which that requires being pretty aware of your surroundings to do that behavior. Another important, but maybe less thought of external stimulus that's important to plants, for plants to react to is gravity. It's basically how plants can grow straight up, whether they're on level ground or on a steep hill. Their roots in particular are able to sense gravity. The roots grow downward, and then the above ground shoots then know that to grow in the opposite direction that the roots are growing. The roots are going to follow gravity, and then the plant itself is going to go opposite of that direction. And so if you produce artificial gravity through centrifugal force on a spinning disk, you plant plants on the outside of that disk, you turn on that centrifugal force. Now the force isn't downward from gravity, it's downward, but it's also at an angle because of the spinning disk. And that causes the roots to grow outwards at an angle. And that kind of tricks the plant to think that gravity is going at an angle. And then the above ground shoots start to grow in the opposite direction of the roots, which means the plants all start growing towards the center of the disc instead of straight up. I saw an awesome demonstration of that in a science museum in Medellin. So plants are responding to gravity. Plants will also respond to other things that I'm not going to get into as much, like temperature and moisture. And I think these are a little more familiar. So ranges of temperature can cause a plant, temperature and humidity can cause a plant to open or close their stomata, which look like little Jim Henson Muppet mouths. Roots can sense that there's water nearby and grow towards that water. Changes in temperature are what stimulate maple trees to produce maple sap in the spring. And there are many examples of how plants respond to their environment in more nonlinear, complex ways, as if they're making a choice, or again, maybe using an algorithm. And the primary stimuli for most plant behavior, again, are the ones that light, temperature, moisture, gravity, touch. There are systems in place for a response behavior for these things, and these systems are based on both chemical and electrical signals. So maybe the beginning of what we call a neural network. And there's intricate biochemical pathways and plant signaling molecules that are like hormones. Usually these are for optimizing growth and reproduction. They can also be used for defense, and that's when things get really bizarre when we start to talk about how plants are able to defend themselves because plants cannot get up and run away or walk away or fight. So there are purely physical mechanisms, so like a sharp barb, stingers, poisons, and stuff in their biology, in their anatomy, that is kind of just like a thing. It's an adaptation. It's not changing, and these are just like the physical mechanisms, physical and chemical mechanisms. These are the ones we're probably most familiar with. But there are also defense systems that involve very complex systems of defense compounds mixed with chemical communication that allow plants not only to stay and fight at a molecular level, but they can also start interacting with allies. So if we have a bean plant and we add a hungry aphid to that bean plant, the aphid is going to start to chew the leaf. Good for the aphid, bad for the plant. If there's several aphids, they're going to start spreading across the leaf, start spreading to the rest of the plant, biting fresh surfaces, creating holes, causing trauma to the plant tissues, and then after that plant, the next logical thing is it's going to start spreading to other plants. So in 1983, there's two scientists, Jack Schultz and Ian Baldwin, who reported that when this happens, for a lot of plants, it may seem like there's nothing they can do, but there are a lot of things they can do. They're not just throwing up the towel and giving up. A plant under attack can and will release warning chemicals. Oftentimes, these are through the air, and neighboring plants can detect those warning signals. So they said it was like a silent scream, but instead of sound waves, the scream consists of airborne VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And they found this case to be the case for a wide variety of plants that are under attack or experiencing trauma. So it's from sagebrush to barley to corn to maple trees to beans to that freshly cut grass. They're essentially screaming out, "Hey, I'm under attack." They're doing it through chemicals. That scream is only effective, however, if somebody can hear it. So if these distress signals reach neighboring bean plants, then those plants at least have the opportunity to receive the signal. And then if they receive it, which they do, they will immediately emit VOCs of their own. So now one scream becomes three screams. It's an amplified scream. And pretty soon you have all of the neighboring plants screaming for help, even though only one of them at this point is directly under attack. They're responding to their neighbors' cries of help. And now these neighbors have the added advantage of time because they're not being eaten yet. And so, in addition to screaming that warning signal, they start to pump out chemicals into their own tissues that are deterrents to the aphids. They're very noxious, and then with enough time, if the aphids go to them and start to eat their leaves, it's going to taste awful, and the aphids are going to be driven away. That alone is an amazing system, but some plants take this even a step further by screaming out not only to warn the other plants, but they're going to scream out to other insects. Not more aphids, but the predators of aphids. They're going to send out a chemical scream that is really an attractant to predatory insects like wasps. And wasps are an aphid's worst nightmare. So now, as the aphids start to spread to neighboring plants, not only do they find their food is becoming spoiled, they're finding that there are killers that were invited to the dinner table, and now they're about to become the meal. And this progression of illustrations, by the way, comes from an NPR story on these experiments. So, after the initial invasion, the plant that first became under attack, unfortunately, could be in pretty bad shape. They could die, but the actions of that plant certainly saved their neighbors. So, again, at the risk of anthropomorphizing plants, or maybe because I want to anthropomorphize plants, you could look at it as the initial plant saving its neighbors at no advantage to its own health, or what we might consider altruism. This is one of the many examples that really turns Darwinism on its head. There are no measurable benefits to that plant to save its neighbors. One could argue that it's selection at the genetic level, if particularly if the neighbors are relatives. One could argue that it's community level adaptation. One could argue that it's altruism. And I think you should look at it through all of those lenses if you want to better understand the processes and effects. So is it communication in plants? I think one could certainly argue that it is. A signal was sent. Two different species, a plant and an animal, heard the alarm, received it, and knew what to do. Sometimes the communication isn't airborne. And again, this was back in the mycorrhizae episode. Plants can send warning signals through the ground through a fungal network in the soil that is known as the wood wide web. And this network not only allows plants to share resources with other plants, even of different species, but it also allows them to communicate and send signals, including warning signals, to their neighbors through this underground forest. So there's very likely a lot of communication happening between plants that we just can't tap into because we don't have the right devices to listen in. Plants are screaming, they're listening, they're calling in reinforcements. There is even evidence that some plants under duress produce actual sounds with sound waves. So researchers at the Institute for Applied Physics in Bonn, Germany, armed with a laser-powered microphone, were able to record sound waves produced by plants that were under trauma. So the trauma might be a physical attack, like we talked about already, of being injured. The trauma could be something like drought, or it could be something else. It doesn't have to be an attack uh, by another animal. But regardless of the trauma, the plants are producing audible sounds. The sounds come from releasing gases. I wish Tori were here. So technically, they're they're farting as much as they are screaming because that's what the audible one is. Or the audible part is that gas release. We can't hear them. They're ultrasonic. We can record them. We can divide the frequency into a sound that's audible to the human ear, like we do with bats. And when you do that, it sounds like a bunch of little popping noises. And what's not well understood is whether other plants can hear those noises. Is that just a purely physical reaction to the plants, or is it a form of communication? And there is evidence that it likely is a form of communication. Some plants have been shown to respond to the sound of their neighbors being eaten. So in this case, it's not the sounds that the plants are making. If a caterpillar is munching on a leaf, it's making a chewing sound, and that chewing sound is picked up and perceived by plant neighbors. And as soon as they hear the sound of a caterpillar chewing on a leaf, just like in the other case, they start to put in their defense mechanisms. So it's maybe a little more morbid because they're not responding to a scream, they're responding to the sound of carnage. So we know that plants can produce sound. We know that plants can hear sound. It's not well understood whether plants can produce sounds that can be heard by other plants. But if that were the case, and it is very possible, then plants are communicating with each other via sound. And that's a medium that we can start to relate to, since sound is a huge part of our communication systems, and most of the sound is ultrasonic that we can't hear. As if this is all crazy enough, it gets crazier when this communication starts to cross species lines. And we already know that resource sharing through fungal networks crosses species lines. So in the mycorrhizal episode, there's an absolutely crazy story of trees. The trees become low in nitrogen. When that happens, they need nitrogen. They signal to their mushroom neighbors in the soil. That causes the mushrooms to lure in springtails, that's a type of insect, while simultaneously producing a poison that kills those springtails that they just lured in. It's like a femme fatale. And then the mushrooms use their hyphae to tap into the newly killed springtails to pick up the nutrients to give them back to the tree. And this only happens when the tree needs the nutrients. So that is just, it's a level of communication between three different kingdoms: the trees, the fungi, and the animals. Another example involves multi-species communication, and this is the sagebrush in the American West. So you have pronghorn antelopes that like to eat a lot of things, including sage. And if they eat sage, the trauma from being eaten causes the sage to send chemical signals in the air. But in this case, they're not picked up by other sage plants, they're picked up by tobacco plants. When the tobacco hears that signal or detects that signal, it emits an odor with it's a mustard-like compound that is utterly repulsive to the antelope. So now this is becoming more and more like a fart because it's produced by gas, and the antelope smells it and just wants to get the heck out of town. So you have a sagebrush enlisting the help of a tobacco plant to get rid of an antelope that is eating it. And there's more examples. We've talked in many past episodes about how there's some plants that have chemical defenses like caffeine and chocolate, tobacco. Those defenses are there because they don't want their plant to get eaten. But humans have figured out that we love the effects these chemicals have on our body, despite the bitterness, aided with sugar or whatever. So what was it put in place as a defense mechanism actually caused chocolate, coffee, and tobacco plants to become immensely popular worldwide. So from an adaptation standpoint, that was amazing. They tapped into another species that really helped them explode their population. But we're not the only animal species that are looking for the caffeine buzz. So there's some bee species be, that seek out caffeine in nectar. They will preferentially go to nectar that has caffeine in it. And so if they find that plants have caffeine in their nectar, they're going to return to those plants, kind of like how we return to our local coffee shop. And the payment comes in the form of pollination instead of cash because the bees enjoy the buzz, the caffeine buzz. In fact, researchers at the University of Greenwich found that caffeinated bees also do their job of pollination more effectively than non-caffeinated bees. So it's even better for the plant to produce that caffeine, which is not only a defense mechanism, but it's also helping its pollination with these bees. It's really hard to say whether plants feel pain. If they do, it's not the same kind of pain that we feel, but there may be other forms of stress or anxiety which starts to lead us down this road of further down this road of plants having some form of sentience. It's a more difficult question. We can say plants are aware of and interact with their surroundings. Caitlin Reinartz told us here on Backyard Naturalist a few years ago that plants, like trees, have to go through a period of dormancy for their own well-being. So our plants do that conveniently in the winter, but even plants in the tropics can't stay awake all year round. They can't be functioning all year. They have to go through a period of dormancy, which is very similar to us going to sleep. And I don't know how they do it, but in a lab, you can actually do the equivalent of keeping a plant awake. You can prevent it from going in dormancy, you can prevent it from going to sleep. And if you do that on a plant, you start to see some of the same negative effects on that plant as you do on animals when they're kept awake. So plants need that sleep for healing purposes and probably for restoration. Um, we just don't know that plants are sleeping. And there's some crazy research with this plant is Mimosa pudica. It's a bean plant. You might know it as the shame plant or the sensitive plant. This is the plant that if you touch it, the leaves kind of fold in immediately like a Venus flytrap, and probably it's a defense mechanism against grazing. But this plant is starting to challenge our assumptions around plant consciousness because recent research has shown that this plant can essentially be put to sleep. It can be anesthetized, and it can be anesthetized with the same substances that are used to anesthetize humans, things like ether and lidocaine. They cause the plant to stop responding to stimuli. It suppresses stimuli. It suppresses the plant's electrical activity. So that suggests that not only do plants sleep, we can actually put them to sleep with the same compounds used by our own anesthesiologists. So does that mean that plants are conscious? It, it certainly means that plants can go in and out of states that resemble consciousness or awareness. So just to remind you again of the few storylines we talked about today. Plant is attacked by predator. Plant screams to neighbor. Neighbors put up their defenses and call in help from a wasp. Plant needs to be pollinated. Plant signals to an insect, gets that insect to not only pollinate it, but become better at its job. Plant is attacked by a predator. Plant signals to a different species to release compounds to deter that predator. Plant needs nutrients. Plant enlists the help of a mushroom neighbor to call in and kill insects and then feed the nutrients from the insects back to the plant. So there's no secret that plants exhibit very sophisticated abilities. They're aware of their surroundings, they react, they engage in complex communication with others, including other species. Some of these are reflexive, instinctual, others hint at a form of cognition, and researchers are really starting to take this seriously. Paco Calvo at the University of Murcia is focusing on identifying factors indicative of cognitive behavior in plants, including things like flexibility, including whether plants can predict directedness toward a goal. Other researchers are starting to look at supporting evidence that plants can remember past events. I was taught as an early researcher the importance of sticking to the scientific process. The scientific process is good, but it's also rigid. And if you even hinted at some of these ideas back then, you'd be ridiculed. People still are ridiculed. But that rigidness and closed-mindedness also is super limiting because if we acknowledge even the slightest possibility that plants have this form of sentience and cognition, it allows us to explore these ideas more and will lead to new discoveries and new applications for us and probably a new way of interacting with the natural world. So I love to be alone in a forest for a lot of reasons. One of them is the silence and tranquility, but it's going to be hard not to think about how much noise and activity is happening all the time at scales we can't perceive and what appears to be just a tranquil forest. And if I take a nap next to a tree, I might also start to ask the question, is the tree also taking a nap next to me? So that is the end of today's episode. I will stop sharing my screen